Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. I would ask everyone here in-house as we prepare to begin to check that cell phones have been turned off as a courtesy. And, of course, we will post our program on our Heritage homepage within the next day for your future reference. And our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments to us, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion today is Walter Lohman, Director of our Asian Studies Center. Prior to joining us at Heritage, he served as Senior Vice President and Executive Director of the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. He has also held positions at the Senate as a staff member on the Republican staff for Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he also served in the 1990s as a policy aide to Senator John McCain, advising him on trade, defense, and foreign policy matters. Currently, Mr. Lohman also serves as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, where he leads a graduate seminar on American foreign policy interests in Southeast Asia. He earned his bachelor's degree in humanities at Virginia Wesleyan and his master's in foreign affairs from the University of Virginia. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Walter Lohman. Walter?
Well, that reference to the 1990s seems older and older. Wow, 1990s, that was a while ago. Well, thank you all for coming out. You know, this is the 8th time that I've done this program here. I was going through that, talk about feeling old. Going back through previous ones the other day and found this is my 8th, but we've done it far more times than that because we did it before I got here as well. As you know, it's an opportunity for you to have some interaction with congressional staffers, hear their views on things, and then have some Q&A with them, and that's what I want to get to today. There's certainly a lot in the news, and it touches on all of their areas of expertise. Hope to cover some foreign policy issues generally, and as they apply to Asia, and maybe as they apply to other parts of the world in the sense that those are relevant. Defense budget and trade issues, all very hot right now, so we should have a very good conversation. What I'd like to do is just go through and say a couple words about each so you know who's here, and then they can go through and give their 10 minutes or so remarks, and we can move right to discussion. First off is going to be Jamie Fly. Jamie is Counselor for Foreign and National Security Affairs for Senator Marco Rubio. Before this, he was Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Initiative from early 2009. He also served on the Bush administration National Security Council staff, and he served in the Bush administration Defense Department. He has a MA in German and European Studies from Georgetown University. We'll then turn to Eric Sayers. Eric is not Nilmani Rubin, if you haven't noticed. He at the last minute here has stepped in and agreed to talk about defense issues, which was actually turned out to be very timely. Eric is now a defense policy advisor to Congressman Randy Forbes, chairman of the House Armed Services Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee, a real leader on defense issues in the U.S. Congress. Eric was previously at the Pacific Forum CSIS in Honolulu, Hawaii. He has a master's degree in science from the Rajaratnam School of International Affairs in Singapore, and a MA in political science from the University of Western Ontario. And then we'll then turn to Brett Doyle, who I think will talk to us a little bit about trade issues, maybe more than the others. But Brett is legislative assistant for Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania. Brett handles his international trade work on the Senate Finance Committee, in addition to covering a series of other issues, including energy, agriculture, and transportation. Brett has worked on a number of GOP campaigns over the years in both Senate and House races. Brett's gotten his degree, his BA, from Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania. So with those brief remarks about our guest's background, I'm going to turn it over to Jamie and let him get us started with the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Walter, and thanks to Heritage for holding this event. It's always good to be back at Heritage. And I just want to say I really appreciate the work, Walter, that you and your colleagues here do on Asia policy. It's very helpful to those of us on the Hill. Walter already outed me in my Europeanist background, so it may be odd for me to be on this panel. I started out studying Europe 15 years ago, and then kind of pivoted to nonproliferation for a number of years in the Bush administration. And now I think I'm going through my own rebalance or pivot to Asia, as my boss is the ranking Republican on the SFRC subcommittee on East Asia, and been spending more time in the region there, certainly in the last year or two. I'm going to talk a little bit about foreign policy and leave the defense and trade issues to my colleagues. I guess I'd just start by saying that, as someone who works on a wide variety of foreign policy issues right now, the thing that struck me about Asia policy for pretty much the entire time of this administration has been about how bipartisan I think that area of U.S. foreign policy has been. We certainly see a lot of heated criticism of the administration on a variety of fronts these days, but I think there still remains a bipartisan amount of support, including on the Hill, for the notion that we need to focus more of our attention and more of our energy on Asia, and an appreciation for the fact that the administration has tried to do that to a certain extent. That said, I think what we're certainly following is that we're getting to the point where I think we need to move beyond just the rhetoric of a pivot or a rebalance and focus more on coming up with a substantive Asia policy that reflects and furthers our interests as well as our values. So I'm going to touch on three areas that I'd just like to highlight and challenges I think we face looking forward for the rest of this administration and then beyond. The first I'd highlight is that I think we have some major issues in terms of how we combat the concern or fears in the region of American decline or distraction, just even given what's going on in the last couple of weeks with Russia and Ukraine as an example, before obviously a lot of concern in Asia about our continuing focus on conflicts in the Middle East, despite our rhetoric about a rebalance or pivot. The second point I want to talk about a little bit is how do we tackle the current challenges we face in the region from a security perspective, first and foremost North Korea, over the longer term a China that's increasingly assertive in its territorial claims, potentially threatening to its neighbors, many of whom are our treaty allies. And then third, which is connected to the first 2 points, is how we build on the alliances we already have with so many partners in the region, and how we improve these relationships to tackle the challenges and provide the reassurances I started off with. So first on the whole issue of American decline or distraction, and this has struck me as I've gone to the region in recent years, because I think no matter how much we've talked about a rebalance or the importance of the region, I don't think our allies have completely bought the notion that America is there to stay and is going to be standing by them when the going gets tough. I think that given what we've been involved with in the Middle East, given even as we wind down the war in Afghanistan and these new crises like Ukraine emerge, this is going to just continue to be a problem over time. Now, that said, I think the fact of the matter is, given how important Asia is, given its population, its importance because of trade and economic issues, however much we may want to focus on other problems, we're not going to be able to ignore what is going to be playing out in Asia in the decades to come. So I think it's important that Congress play a role in keeping up the pressure on the administration, even as it's juggling all these balls and trying to stay on top of crises, to keep focused on some key elements of the rebalance. And to that, I think the most important aspect of that, from my perspective, is keeping up the diplomatic attention that was started early in the administration and seems to have faded away to a certain extent. I think the president's trip in April is obviously going to be watched very closely in the region, and there are great hopes for the outcomes of that trip. I think some of the things that even have been troubling people, and as Secretary Kerry has made some efforts to spend more time there, despite his commitments in the Middle East. Shortly before one of his recent trips, he talked about climate change being the key issue on the trip. I think that struck some of our allies in the region as a bit odd. And so I think even just the messaging we put out about what our priorities are in the region is incredibly important. Obviously, on the defense side, and I'll let Eric touch on this more, but getting a long-term fix to sequestration, tackling entitlement reform is key, and obviously a successful TPP outcome, I think, is essential too, that need to be part of this broader strategy. And then I also think that our policy in other areas of the world, this is something that Senator Rubio highlights on a regular basis, also are very relevant to the perceptions of our allies, because they watch very closely how we handle our alliances and our relationships with partners elsewhere, going back to how we handled the drawdown in Iraq, and even I think what the outcome in Afghanistan looks like. I think people pay attention to that, and they get nervous if they see certain trends. I think you could even make the same argument about what we're seeing play out right now with Russia, obviously invading and apparently heading towards annexation of a neighbor. Obviously, anyone who's facing territorial claims of a much larger neighbor is going to watch that situation very closely, and how the U.S. and the international community respond, and read things into that, even if there aren't clear similarities. So second, talking about the challenges I think that we're focused on right now in the region from a security perspective, I think the immediate and kind of near term, obviously, there's a lot of interest and focus on North Korea, concern about provocations in the coming months. I think there's growing interest on Capitol Hill in increasing sanctions against Pyongyang. If you just look at the sanctions regimes that have been put in place against a number of other rogues, North Korea's sanction regime is much looser than the Iran's or even Burma used to be, and so I think there's an interest in exploring some of those tools, especially given that, as we saw with Banco Delta Asia in the Bush administration, some of those levers that we had were one of the few things that seemed to, at least temporarily, bring the North Koreans to the table. I know one thing that my boss certainly feels very strongly is that we also need to use our values in these discussions, including about North Korea. And just several weeks ago, we had the UN Commission of Inquiry issue a pretty damning report about the situation in North Korea. The prison camps where hundreds of thousands of people have basically been sentenced to a life of hard labor, often for nothing more than just being associated with a particular family that they were born into. It concluded that there are crimes against humanity that have been committed. And I think there's a lot of interest in Capitol Hill in trying to raise awareness about those issues and speaking very frankly about what is going on. I think we also need to be very cautious about the notion that we can get China to change its position anytime soon on North Korea, despite the recent provocations. And I think there certainly would be a significant concern if we see more rhetoric from the administration, as happened at some point last year. Secretary Kerry talking about the notion that the U.S. might change its defense posture in the region and de-emphasize missile defense and things like that if North Korea made certain gains as an effort to lure in the Chinese to change their policy. I think the general view would be that that's a fruitless effort. On China, we obviously face a long-term challenge. I think there are a lot of opportunities with China. I think there's a real question hanging out there, though, about which path China will take, whether it's going to head in the direction of being a constructive player in the international system that contributes to regional and global security rather than just benefiting from that system that we and our allies help uphold, or whether it's going to pursue a more destructive confrontational path with its neighbors. Key to this, I think, is what we can do to reassure some of what I would call our frontline allies and some of these key issues, whether it's stating very clearly what U.S. policy is regarding the Senkaku Islands with Japan, standing by Taiwan and finding ways to make sure that it does not get left behind as we talk about a rebalance, as it seems to have been until now. If you look at the administration's talk about a rebalance, you never see Taiwan referenced. And as I said on North Korea, I think there's also a values component there with China, because I think if you just talk to China's neighbors, they understand that how a country treats its citizens says something about how it's likely to treat its neighbors and those around it. That I think for China, its own economic success obviously is going to be the most advanced if it can actually allow its people to have their own individual freedoms and prosper. Just today, actually, I think as we speak, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is marking up, for instance, a resolution on press freedoms in China. And so I think and that's a bipartisan resolution that Senator Rubio has co-sponsored with Senator Cardin, Senators Menendez, and others. And I think there's a lot of bipartisan agreement on that issue, certainly in the Senate. The final point I just want to touch on is this whole question of where we take our alliances going forward to tackle these challenges. Obviously, until now, in Asia, which has always struck me, obviously, as a major, coming from someone who studied European issues, is the major difference between Asia and Europe is in the post-war World War II order, how we constructed this hub and spoke model of alliances, bilateral agreements, rather than regional institutions. And I don't know that Asia is going to be ready for regional institutions anytime soon, or that would be that helpful. However, I do think there's a need to maybe look at more of a networked approach. So it's not the U.S. just dealing bilaterally with all of these allies and at the center of everything. I think it's a good thing if our allies can partner more together, even if we're not necessarily in the room or participating in exercises. And I know we've begun to see some of that in the military realm, and I think we need more of it. But I think even in terms of diplomatic relationships, in terms of agreements on intel sharing, sharing of certain military capabilities, all of these things are, I think, efforts that we should encourage and try to bring our allies together to work on. Having said that, I do think over time we do also need to take a close look at our regional institutions and see whether they're up to confronting these threats that we do face in the region in the decades to come. I'll just say something briefly on Japan and South Korea. I've been to both places in the last few months, and I do think that it's very important that we find a way to get our partners in Tokyo and Seoul to overcome their differences and work together, because I think certainly dealing with whether it's the North Korea threat or other regional issues, that's going to be essential to our success. And I'm sure that's something that the President will be focused on when he visits both countries in April. I also think that, and this is something that Senator Rubio stressed when he was in Tokyo, that we should be very supportive of Prime Minister Abe's efforts to allow the Japanese self-defense forces to participate in collective self-defense missions, which I think will be very beneficial to U.S. security and to the security of our allies in the region. And obviously we need to be doing all we can to build up capacity of all other partners. And I've read just today that there's been recent progress with the framework agreement with the Philippines, which is incredibly important. And I think there's broad support for that. And then also expanding these networks and relationships to new allies, such as India, and also to other partners in Southeast Asia. So looking at that list of things that I think we should be doing in the years ahead, there's obviously a lot to do. And obviously key to being able to kind of have the clout and be convincing to our allies that we're going to remain a Pacific power and not going anywhere is going to be getting into some of the areas that my colleagues are going to be talking about. So I think I'll just end by saying that in conclusion, I think that the Obama administration has gotten us off to a decent start with our Asia policy and the rebalance. I think you'll continue to see constructive criticism from Republicans in Congress, trying to hold them accountable perhaps to their own rhetoric. But I think in general that there is broad agreement on the importance of this region, and in even general agreement on the approach. It's just a matter of us tackling some of these major issues that will hold us back from having a successful strategy. Thanks.
Thank you, Jamie. Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Walter. Just going to try to squeeze in here. Thanks to Walter and the Asia Studies Center for having me over. It's always great to be back at Heritage, where I really got my start about 7 years ago as a young, aspiring research assistant. Excuse me, I'm just kind of getting over a cold. I'm going to talk a bit more about the defense side of this equation. Jamie touched on a few of, I think, the important points at the end, especially with Japan. I want to start by speaking to the Armed Services Committee, which my boss is a member of. He's the chairman of the Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee. Subcommittee, I think, that kind of has the key equities that really affect the region from a defense perspective. And I want to talk a bit about the QDR, which just came out last week, and some of the elements within that and how it affects the region, and then maybe get down into the the tactical level and some of the capabilities that we're really talking about, and some of the shortfalls associated with those capabilities. So I had the pleasure of being on this panel again last year, where I talked a bit about how I saw our Armed Services Committee on the House side, which, the SASC is a different beast. I can really only speak to the HASC, but one of the things that I really have seen over the last 3 years with Mr. Forbes is that, the committee was set up to focus on a lot of the issues that we're involved in, the wars that we're involved in Iraq and Afghanistan in particular. And the structure of the committee, the hearings, inevitably, just like the department's attention, was very much rightfully focused on those issues. But that was, in some regards, there was a lack of focus on the Asia Pacific, on not just some of our allies, but some of the capabilities that are important for that region. And so last summer, my boss and a few other members, Democratic members, I think Jamie is very right, this is a bipartisan issue. We did a letter to Chairman McKeon, and we tried to initiate a task force or a special subcommittee that could focus on defense issues related to the Asia Pacific, the Korean Peninsula, the re-rise of China, our defense portfolio, kind of across that perspective. And Mr. McKeon was very gracious and let us go forward with that. We worked with Ms. Hanabusa, the congressman from Hawaii, Democratic congressman from Hawaii. And over the last 4 or 5 months, we held a series of hearings, classified, unclassified, and everything from minute issues like space, very important minute issues like space, to larger issues like our posture and our laydown in the region with PACOM and the department. And we saw that as an effort to rebalance the Congress. We've jokingly talked about to rebalance the committee in its attention and its focus, and we think we were pretty successful in that. One of the things that I think we're most proud of is that we did an Asian Ambassador Roundtable. We had 6 ambassadors from Northeast and Southeast Asia over for about an hour. We're planning to do another one in the next couple months. Really kind of heard from all of them. Japan and Korea were there, as well as Australia, New Zealand, and the Philippines, and Singapore as well. And so that was a chance for some of the members, Republicans and Democrats, to not just hear from one ambassador kind of on a touch-and-go office call or over drinks, I guess, in town at a happy hour, but to sit down and talk about some of the substantive issues between our bilateral relationships, but also multilaterally. One of the other issues that I think, just touching on the HASC thing as well, that we really saw a deficit in that last summer, but during these hearings, something that was teased out was the lack of a strategy for the Asia Pacific region. I think the rhetoric has been right. I think that this administration has continued some of the successful policies of previous administrations in the region in terms of alliance management, these types of issues. Of course, there's some issues lacking on the defense side that I'll get into, but one of the shortfalls has been following up that rhetorical rebalance with an actual strategy. And by strategy, I mean something that's unclassified, that isn't just a signaling document to our allies and our competitors and to folks around town, but an actual strategy like was done during other administrations in the past that talked about not just the ends we want in the region, but the ways and the means to get there, and the resources necessary to signal to Congress and others how we can get there. And we did a letter last summer, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats signed it, again bipartisan, to Susan Rice, who is the National Security Advisor, of course, saying, hey, we agree with the direction you're focused on, but we'd like to work with you on developing some sort of Asia Pacific strategy review. And unfortunately, we got a response back from the State Department and Acting Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs, from a congressional perspective, kind of something that was kicked over and not really dealt with in a way that we had hoped, in a serious way that we had hoped. And it was sort of kicked down the road, and we sort of saw that as a way to say, we take your concerns, we think they're important, but we're not interested in doing that right now. And I guess as the Hill likes to do, we saw this as an important enough issue. We've rallied some more members, and we continue to push on that issue. There's actually some language in the omnibus, the budget bill from 2 months ago, that said, here's some appropriated money. State Department should lead an interagency strategy review. And we look forward to working. We're going to do another letter, I think, on that this week to continue to push that issue, to set an expectation for what will come out of that. We think that, if the next 3 years are going to be a real value, one of the things that a key element of that would be for a document like this, in classified and unclassified form, to come back. Moving on to the QDR, again, a document that just came out last week, a document we've been doing now for about 15 or 20 years. Republicans threw it out, and because the means certainly weren't there, pretty quickly. My boss, his perspective was a little more nuanced. We said that we think the ship was pointed in he's a Sea Power chairman, of course. The ship was pointed in the right direction, but the propeller wasn't there. The resources weren't there to take it in that direction. If you look through it carefully, it's a stark difference from 4 years ago or 8 years ago or 12 years ago. if you're looking at it from an Asia Pacific perspective or sitting in capitals in the region, it prioritizes Asia Pacific as at the top of the list. And not just that, but it prioritizes the resources in terms of defense, naval, Marine Corps, some of the projection forces, kind of across those services, including the Air Force. And so in terms of the pointing the ship in the right direction from an Asia Pacific perspective, it's not bad. That being said, the resources just aren't there. This budget lacks the resources to build the shipbuilding plan to where it needs to be, to get the Air Force to where it needs to go, to keep the Marine Corps, and not only at a top line level it needs to be in terms of end strength, but in terms of resources and some of the other initiatives that they have over the next 5 and 10 years. To get down into those details a little bit more, I think that the department's struggling obviously with sequestration. We've had kind of some back and forth with the department over the last 3 or 4 years on these issues. They haven't been forthright in the degree to which sequestration was really going to hurt them until now. We're finally starting to see some of that in this QDR and elsewhere. We've had a couple posture hearings in the last few weeks. But this budget, and my boss has said this, the trend lines are headed in the wrong direction. If we're really going to prioritize the capabilities that we need to reinforce the rebalance, if you want to use that term, or just the United States' long-term enduring security interests in the region, we're going to need to see a higher top line. Under that top line, I wanted to just mention some of the capabilities that we're looking to that we think are important. We were pleased to see the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Hagel, talk about the need for a larger Navy, for more hulls in the water. But again, the contradiction there was they're cutting half the cruiser fleet out, 11 of 22 cruisers. They're canceling their relatively cheap small surface combatant, the littoral combat ship. They're now, I just got the 30-year shipbuilding plan, they're now going to start counting ships like the hospital ship and patrol craft ships, small combatants that operate in the Gulf as part of the battle force fleet, which I wouldn't consider a hospital ship part of the battle force fleet. Beyond that, in terms of the Navy, I mean, the budget just isn't there, and the Navy's facing some serious challenges in the next couple of years in terms of its budget. Right now, it's $14 or $15 billion a year for shipbuilding. It's going to need to get up to 19 or 20 just to meet the Navy's current requirements, which my boss would consider more of a minimalist requirement. And then when you're cutting all the other force structure out, as we are, to try to save some of these dollars in the medium term, it's just putting near-term risk on your force. Beyond that, we talk about some of the big, the shiny platforms. I think one of the other things that I would point to as important is also the payloads. This is something that our Chief of Naval Operations has talked about, payloads and platforms. It's expensive to build big platforms. You keep them for 30 years. They're around a long time. The way to be nimble, the way to modernize more quickly and meet kind of some of the growing security demands is to focus on the payloads, in particular munitions. One of the shortfalls we've had, just as a small example with our Navy, this is well known in the Asia Pacific, our PACOM commander has talked about it publicly a lot more, is that we're outsticked with our surface combatants in the Asia Pacific. Our Harpoon is 40 years old. It is what experts call a dumb missile. You just shoot it out there and hope it hits something. And it's not built for the demands of an anti-access area denial environment like we're seeing in the Asia Pacific. And you see the Chinese, they have a missile that actually can reach our ships before ours can reach them. And so one of the things that we're trying to focus on in our subcommittee and the Navy's really focusing on is building a new long-range anti-ship missile, an offensive anti-surface weapon. And that's one of the things that we can do kind of the next 2 or 3 years to really meet some of those demands that we're seeing from PACOM. The other area is projection forces. The carrier debate, the Air Force debate with where things are headed. We need a lot more long-range power projection, I think, and my boss has written quite a bit about this. The Air Force is trying to build a new long-range bomber. Most of its bombers, the vast majority of 85% or so, are not survivable in anti-access environments. Only our B-2s are, and we only have 20 of them. We're supposed to build a new long-range bomber sometime over the next 15 years, and we say 80 to 100, but that's a debate that will be finalized 15 or 20 years from now. That's really something that the Air Force has prioritized, but that the Congress is going to have responsibility in making sure that we continue to authorize and appropriate at the levels that the Air Force needs to get that bomber in the future. The other power projection piece, and bear with me, these are a little bit more in the weeds, is the Navy's kind of future power projection asset, or what they're calling a U-class, carrier-based unmanned platform. This is going to complement its current air wing of F-35, planned air wing of F-35Cs and F-18s. But the Navy really needs more reach to get out there, to be able to operate the carrier a little, maybe if it needs to in the future, further away, but to still be able to project power where it needs to hold assets at risk. And my boss has written public about this. We've written the Navy on it. We're hoping that they can develop a system that has a longer range, that is stealthy and can operate in those non-permissive environments. Lastly, on allies, I will actually mention space. I think cyber gets a lot of attention in terms of one of those domains that is really important, that a lot of industry's focused on, that the department's very much focused on, and the government and the Hill. But space, I think, I put it right there with cyber, is important, especially in Asia Pacific. That's one thing in the QDR, I think, that came out that I was surprised by. It was quite hawkish language on space and where we see our competitors going in terms of anti-satellite capabilities. And that's something that the Congress has been taking more briefings on and classified discussions on where that's headed and some of the resources that we need to get. All of DoD, but especially PACOM, headed in the right direction. Finally, on allies, I hesitate to get in there because, of course, you're never going to be able to mention all the allies, and you have to pick and choose. But I want to talk specifically about Japan. Jamie and I were just there, and the Philippines. I really think Japan, like a lot of the rest of the region, the trend lines are in the right direction. It's one of the few countries when the United States is cutting its in real terms its defense budget. Japan's is actually increasing theirs. They just put out a new National Defense Program guidelines, which, like the last one 3 years ago, is quite forward-leaning. Is pushing their Ministry of Defense in a direction that prioritizes some of those capabilities that they need for the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, ISR and mobility and different offensive capabilities. They're also restructuring their government in ways that, from our trip, we were very excited about. It's only been a couple months on the National Security Council, but I think from an interagency perspective, this is a really good sign for the future of the alliance. Also in Philippines, just to conclude, this is it's an area in its alliance that's critical, not just because of geography and our longstanding relationship with the Philippines going back the last 100 years, but going forward, it's one of those places where Japan has the resources to work with the United States, but in many ways to take a lead on some of its issues with China and the East China Sea. Philippines just lacks the resources. They've set out a defense budget for the next 10 years or so to get there, but they really need help from their allies. And this is a place that I think, from a diplomatic perspective, there's a lot of opportunities for trilateral and multilateral cooperation. Japan's stepped up and is offering, I think, 10 ships or a dozen small coastal combatants to help the Philippines. We're trying to sell and pass some of our retired ships. It's really an area. We've also worked with them, with the Australians, to build up their Coast Watch program. So they have the ISR to see in their maritime periphery, see around their maritime periphery. That's one of the areas that I'd say is the most critical but the least discussed, is helping the Philippines build their forces in a way that can be interoperable with the alliance and share information with the alliance, and also with Japan and Southeast Asia, so they have a real handle on their maritime domain, and we have maritime domain awareness going forward. There's lots of other great things going on, some of the other allies and partners in the region, and I've been traveling a lot to Southeast Asia recently and spent a year in Singapore in the past. We can certainly get into those in the Q&A, but I don't want to try to touch on each one of them with my limited time. So thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Brett, please.
Thank you, and thanks to Walter for inviting me, and to the Heritage Foundation for hosting this. Appreciate the opportunity to come here and just let everyone know what I've been seeing in my capacity over the past year or so. I think everyone here touched on a lot of good things, but I want to focus more on the trade component and where the Hill is on trade issues right now. First off, I'd just like to start by saying that I think, in terms of the American business community, no one really underestimates the just raw potential that the Asian market is or has for just American firms and American products and American brands. I can't talk about every single industry today, obviously, but you've definitely seen big push from the American agricultural community, which is actually very interesting, because I think America is one of the few countries where the agricultural community actually is very supportive of free trade agreements, and they've been very vocal about their willingness to be engaged in TPP and other trade talks, and trying to find ways to deal with certain market access issues that they've been seeing. Also, we have the pharmaceutical industry. There's someone who's been very, very present in a lot of these discussions. And also, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention just the sheer opportunity that some of these FTAs have for the American energy industry. As you know, current law prevents liquefied natural gas or LNG exports to countries that we do not have FTAs with unless you go through a pretty expansive DOE and FERC approval process. So potentially, if we did have a TPP, that would open up many new nations to American LNG exports, which is something that I think we're going to see more and more talk about in the coming months and years. First of all, I think going back to TPA and the need for Trade Promotion Authority, I think the past year we've seen kind of net progress in getting everyone on the same page. Obviously, the president mentioned the need for TPA in the State of the Union address. The vice president has been saying all the right things in some of the op-eds that he's been putting out recently, including one that ran the Financial Times a couple weeks back. And we've also been hearing more and more about the White House staff just doing rounds on the Hill and doing rounds with outside groups in promoting the need for Trade Promotion Authority. Trade Ambassador Froman and White House Chief of Staff McDonough have been doing a lot in meeting with different members. And also, I really do want to mention just all the great work that Secretary Pritzker at the Commerce Department has been doing in terms of TPA. She's been probably the single most vocal supporter of free trade in the administration. And she's been doing great work in both putting out public statements, and also her staff has been doing great work. And just really letting everyone know just how much market liberalization and free trade really does benefit the American economy. Obviously, we haven't seen things go as fast as we'd like in Congress. You know, we did see the Baucus-Hatch Camp bill. My boss, Senator Toomey, was a supporter of that bill, and he was very disappointed to see that that did not make its way out of committee or even be marked up. You know, I think on the Republican side, especially in the Senate Finance Committee conference, you know, everyone's more or less on the same page that we really do need TPA, that we do need these trade agreements, and we need to give our trade negotiators the authority to negotiate with credibility in the room with their foreign counterparts. Obviously, you know, we didn't see that move as fast as we would like, but, you know, we are always hoping that, you know, with Senator Wyden coming in, that we are going to see more markups and more hearings on TPA and just trade in general. I did want to touch base on a couple issue-specific or industry-specific issues that are really, we're hearing a lot about in terms of getting these trade agreements done, especially the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. For agriculture, who really does want to see these agreements go forward in a high standard fashion, they're seeing real market access issues, and there is a growing sense of frustration with Japan in particular. Obviously, some of the statements that the Japanese trade negotiators put out that they weren't going to touch certain agricultural supports and commodity subsidies are very disappointing. You know, the Wall Street Journal just had a good piece today mentioning, I think that Japan is one of the highest, has one of the highest subsidy rates in terms of individual farmers and their net income that comes from government subsidies, and that came out today. And obviously, you've seen that. That's been noticed on the Hill. Senator Grassley just issued a joint letter with about 17 of his colleagues just talking about the real frustration that Japan's posing in terms of agricultural market access. And again, that's pretty significant considering agriculture is typically one of the constituencies that's most vocally pro-trade. So really getting movement on that is a big priority for a lot of members, and it's a big priority for just moving TPA and TPP along in general. You know, we're also seeing some sanitary and phytosanitary issues in Asia as well, including the ractopamine issue in Taiwan. Obviously, you know, we've seen the Taiwanese government open up the marketplace for American beef with ractopamine, but it's, again, for the livestock commodity producers, it's a big issue for the pork, and that's another issue that's getting a lot of members' attention, at least from what I'm seeing. The other big industry and big constituency that has a lot of issues with what's going on with these things right now that we're seeing that members are responding to is the issue of pharmaceutical intellectual property, especially not just in TPP member countries or negotiating countries, but in India as well. Obviously, in the past year, with some of the compulsory licensing issues, we have seen a lot, and the Hill has responded to that pretty aggressively, I would think. You know, we had over 170 members of the House write a letter talking about just intellectual property concerns in the Indian space, just in general, but also in the pharmaceutical sector. We saw my boss, Senator Toomey, joined with about 19 other of his colleagues also writing to Secretary Kerry asking him to make intellectual property protections in India just a really key issue during his recent trip there. And, you know, we still are seeing issues with the Indian government, and USTR is also talking about, too, how in their most recent Special 301 report, just how India still really does have a patent system, an intellectual property system that favors indigenous innovation as opposed to patents created and researched by foreign entities, which is really something that's a problem just in general, and it's a huge problem for not just the pharmaceutical sector, but also the high-tech sector and the other high research sectors that the United States is really a leader on. And this is a growing trend that a lot of people are very concerned about, just having bifurcated patent systems going forward. And to that extent, I know my boss has had some issues with what the USTR has tabled most recently for the pharma IP chapter in TPP, which is really this two-tiered approach where developing nations, in terms of pharmaceutical intellectual property rights, have to follow lower and less strict standards than quote-unquote developed nations, as determined by, I think, the World Bank per capita GDP number. And that's really something that there's some bipartisan concern about because, frankly, if you're going to hold developing nations and developed nations to different standards in terms of how they have to protect and support intellectual property rights, that's basically implying that intellectual property rights are a burden for developing economies, which is something that I think fundamentally there's a lot of disagreement about on both sides of the aisle. Where I think, especially at Heritage, people here are quick to tell you and quick to know that property rights are basically essential tools to growing an economy, and having a stable property rights system is really important on that front. And one final thing I did want to touch about that we are hearing, especially in recent days, from a constituency on the Hill about the real need for free trade agreements is on the energy space. As I mentioned before, you can't have LNG exports from the United States to a non-FTA country unless you go through a pretty lengthy approval process. And I think, especially in recent days with what's happening with the Russia situation, we're starting to see how different governments can use their energy production capabilities for a lot of geopolitical pressure to put on other nations. And so one thing that I think there's a lot of potential about, and I really do want to touch upon, is just that the LNG marketplace in Asia is absolutely massive and could have huge, huge implications, not just for the United States, but for energy security for all of really the players in the region. The Energy Information Administration came out the other day with their findings in the preliminary 2014 energy outlooks, stating that by 2040, they estimate we will produce about, on net, 6 trillion cubic feet of natural gas exports by 2040. They also, in a similar study that was conducted by NERA on behalf of DOE, they estimate that Asian LNG needs for imports will increase by about 14 trillion cubic feet. So again, that's a big economic opportunity that's driving a lot of people to the trade front. Not only is that billions of dollars to leaseholders, to everyone involved in the transport of the gas, to steel companies and equipment manufacturers who are supplying the drillers and the support crews. But again, it also does really point towards a broader kind of strategic issue for the United States, where a lot of nations and a lot of governments, including Japan, the Philippines, and Taiwan, they're pretty dependent upon really two small areas for where they want to get their energy flow from. If you exclude kind of the coal and some of the LNG imports from the Australian Oceania region, but the bulk of a lot of their energy supplies do come from either the Middle East or Russia, which in the Middle East, if you want to get LNG or fuel oil to the States, you basically have to go through the Straits of Malacca. And, obviously we've seen in the recent days the Russian government's ability to kind of lean on, their state-owned enterprises to kind of use the sale of energy exports as a geopolitical tool. It kind of puts some of our allies and our, some of our friendlier nations in these countries and in this region in a really tough spot. So a situation where you could see the Russian government either using the same amount of pressure towards a more LNG-dependent Asia, or a situation where you'd see some sort of disruption in the Straits of Malacca could be really problematic for the United States and for its allies from a strategic point of view. And one thing that I think really puts this into focus is right now, just Japan and the situation Japan is in, where after the tsunami, they practically lost 30% of their energy capacity overnight. I think nuclear power was producing close to 30% of Japan's power, or electric power. And when they shut down all of their facilities, they basically had to ramp that back up with increased oil and LNG demand, producing facilities. Now they're still down about 10%, I think, overall. But they did have to ramp up oil and LNG to get back up to that point. I think now about 63% of all their electricity comes from either oil or LNG. Now, when you think about that, 40% of their LNG and the vast majority of all their oil resources come from either the Mideast or Russia. If something were to happen where that supply were to be cut off, I mean, that would be a really catastrophic situation and could have really serious, but just negative impacts in the region. So I think there is a lot of, kind of pent up demand for having additional sources of these resources. And the United States, right now is really suited to meet not quite all, but a real significant portion of that energy demand. And I think that's something where, especially in recent days, you're seeing a lot of members talk more and more about that. And this is bipartisan too. You're seeing Senator Barrasso from Wyoming. You're also seeing Senator Udall from Colorado, and Senator Begich and Senator Inhofe talk more and more and more about the real need to kind of supply American energy on the world marketplace. So I think you are seeing kind of a convergence on just the real need for the United States economy to kind of participate more globally. And while that's not translating necessarily into getting TPA across the finish line right now, I think you are seeing more and more, especially in speeches, talking points, committee hearings, the real need to participate and the real value that a forum like TPP and a forum, like our trade agreements can really play on that front. So, kind of just to wrap things up, because I don't want to take up too much time out of the Q&A session, in terms of getting TPA done, and that's still pretty uncertain, but I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic, and there are a lot of independent factors that are kind of driving different member offices to realizing just the real potential here for American businesses and the American consumer.
That's great. Thank you. That was really outstanding from all three of you. Appreciate it. Covered the whole waterfront here. I want to open it up to questions. I always have a couple in my pocket if you don't have anyone immediately, but glad to take questions. Maybe I could come back to the trade issue while folks think a little bit. This process is so closely guarded. The whole, for good reason, the whole trade negotiation process, and those on the inside of the process have good information, obviously, and those on the outside have less. And what we're always doing on the outside is kind of reading the tea leaves. We're trying to figure out what's going on just based on the speeches and the outreach and that sort of thing. And a lot of the things that I see in the tea leaves are actually really worrying about whether we're going to get something that it's a real free trade agreement with the TPP, or whether it's going to be heavily managed in certain sectors like autos, and whether it's going to be larded up with environment and labor provisions and things like that. But whenever I talk to my friends that are on the inside, they always tell me, "Don't worry about it. It's going along. It's it's going to be just like the Bush era trade agreements. It's not. They're not really talking about much different." Number one, why is there this sort of division that I at least I haven't seen before, that is division in sort of the conclusions that you can draw, and why shouldn't I be worried?
I'll take that. I think USTR could be better in their consultation process. So I think, obviously whenever there's a lack of information, I think people will have a tendency to assume the worst. Again, though, I think there's a big onus on getting a good, high-quality, ambitious trade deal done, because at the end of the day, you do need to get the votes in Congress to get it through. And I think, I think the people who are working on these deals are cognizant of that, and they're aware of that. And I think they can kind of look at who are the members and who are, kind of the interest groups that are most likely to be supportive of a trade agreement, are most likely to be gettable in a trade agreement, and who are the members who may be, more skeptical of trade and maybe more reticent to support a trade agreement no matter what it looks like. So I think there is going to be this big push to get something across the finish line, and I think that ultimately the deal that does have the greatest chance of success to get across the finish line is a free trade deal that is much more free trade than managed trade. I think when you start playing the game of who wins what and who gets what, then it's kind of like tax reform. You're going to have people who just lose inherently, and those people who lose are going to be the ones who rally the troops against it. So I think you kind of do have to have a sense where it is more free trade and no one feels slighted or left out.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. Well, that is reassuring. Yeah, right here in the center.
With
We have a microphone for you if you want to wait just a second, although you have a pretty good voice there. I thought you had a microphone.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. I'm Rob Warren from DACOR. I'd like to come back to you, Mr. Doyle, and that is concerning the TPP. What is the possibility that China might join? And if so, what conditions would you expect? If without China, do you think they will be able to organize their own trade arrangement with other countries in ASEAN and elsewhere in East Asia that might be interested in more liberal trade?
Right. Well, you definitely do see some of those conversations occurring. I think the ultimate goal for TPP is to have, kind of a living agreement where people can come and join if they meet certain high standards. So I would expect that, first of all, I think a lot of these efforts need to be focused on getting TPP done to begin with. Whether or not they'll be in the first round or the first go of it, I don't think I'm seeing really any indication suggest that would happen right now, although I don't want to say definitively one way or the other. But I do think, if we do get a good, like I said, high standard TPP agreement done, I do think, the door will be open to other trade partners, including, China, if they did want to meet those standards to get involved. I don't think there'd be a reason to, at least from a trade perspective, to exclude them from that.
Great, Ty.
Hi, Kevin Mayer from NMV Consulting. Eric Sayers, you mentioned that the Hill welcomed Prime Minister Abe's direction in their security policy in terms of enhancing their capabilities. Refreshing to hear that view. But I was wondering if you could comment on some of the hand-wringing that's been taking place in Washington and the Obama administration about the Yasukuni visit and how Abe is moving to the right and remilitarizing, those kind of views that float around D.C. sometimes.
Yeah, I'd be happy to take the tough ones. This is on the record, of course, where it was. The shrine visit, we certainly got some of those visits that came around in December too, and asking, from various officials, how would this be received in our office as well as others on the House side. I can say, resoundingly said it wouldn't be received very well, and we think it would be debilitating to some of our relationships in the region. Where it's been most challenging on the Hill is those like my boss who want to be an advocate, a public advocate for the direction that Tokyo is taking and the Abe government is taking. It has been, we have to spend the first half of the conversation, making excuses is the wrong term, but trying to talk through some of the challenges, some of the difficulties associated with that shrine visit before we can get to why we think where the direction is going is such a good thing. So it's become sort of a distraction to those who want to be advocates and those who want to speak loudly for the government. One of the things that was most striking to me in our recent visit to Japan is, unfortunately, I think, we spend most of the time talking about challenges with Seoul and Korea and Japan and challenges between the United States' alliances, which certainly are concern for us and need to be worked out. And we spend less of our time hearing or talking about some of the very real challenges to Japanese security in the East China Sea from China and some of the pressures that they're using, coercion, militarily and economically. And so the visit was set up a challenge for those who want to be strong advocates for Abe, is how I'd say it.
Great. I thought you were going to ask about dolphins. Yeah, did you have a question? We have a microphone for you so other folks can hear.
Yeah, Elliot Waldman from Tokyo Broadcasting System. I did want to kind of highlight on what seems to be a tension between sort of supporting Japan in what it does in ramping up its defense spending and the defense guidelines and intel sharing with the U.S. and on, praising these things as positive on the one hand, but also stressing the need for better relations with the ROK. There seems to be kind of a little bit of a contradiction there, not only because those actions that Japan is taking do raise tensions and do cause some nervousness among the ROK and other neighbors, but also because from the Japanese side, there's a kind of this perception that, hey, we're upholding our end of the bargain by taking on an increased burden of the alliance in the East Asia and in the Pacific. So why doesn't the U.S. have our back more when it comes to things like historical issues and Yasukuni? But maybe you could talk about how to finesse that a little bit better.
You want to hand that off to Jamie? Since you,
Yeah, sure. I can follow that after that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that's something you hear when you're in the region. I do think, I mean, it's hard to say exactly, but I know the Japanese have tried to be very transparent with all of their neighbors about even the new defense guidelines in terms of sharing information and briefing. And so I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that Seoul, for instance, is adamantly opposed to any increased Japanese defense capabilities or something along those lines. I mean, I think if you just look at the threats that both countries share, even in the near term, vis-a-vis North Korea, it's just common sense that Japan and South Korea are going to need to work together to deal with those challenges. And so I think that they, even in Seoul, would understand that in certain contingencies, it's in their interest if Japan can move towards collective self-defense. And so I think that there are ways that we can be supportive from a U.S. perspective of these increased Japanese capabilities without getting bogged down in the historical debates. Prime Minister Abe, I know, has said that he wants to have a summit with President Park. He's also willing to have a summit with President Xi of China. And so my guess is, and there's a decent chance in the coming months, that you may see some efforts on either side to reach out and try to work through some of these issues. When you talk to people at the working level, they certainly want to do that and are already engaging in their conversations on a variety of issues. And I think they understand the need to work together. So I don't necessarily think that it's good for the U.S. to kind of certainly publicly to get in the middle of these issues, because they're very emotional issues. And I don't know that it's our place to really weigh in strongly in public one way or the other on either side. But I do think we can very clearly remind both allies that it is in U.S. interest for them to work through these challenges and find a way to work together.
And just 2 brief points. I think it's, I would agree with Jamie. I would push back a bit on the contradiction issue. I think it's only natural that Japan is moving to become a more normal power. I think that's been an evolution of the last 20 years. I wish it had occurred earlier, and it was starting to occur during the Cold War, of course, but to the degree that we've seen in the last 20 years, and especially the last 5 or 6 years, I think that's a natural evolution. The part of the challenge, and these are very emotional issues, is the grammar as well, the grammar that's used. I mean, the capabilities and the decision-making and what's actually in there in the budget is one thing. The grammar makes it difficult in some regards, but you've seen some good attempts, I think, from the Japan side to make headway on issues that might have become issues. The NDPG release, the National Defense Program Guidelines, my understanding was it was briefed out to counterparts in Seoul and in Beijing beforehand, and you didn't see in the press loud responses in talks of militarization afterwards. And so I think there's just tactful things like that as well that can go on behind the scenes that can head some of this off.
Betty, orange jacket.
Hi, Betty Lin of the World Journal. Has had a big press conference when you launched the China hearings, and I wonder if the China hearings will go on after Chairman McKeon stepped down. And also, I interviewed Chairman Forbes when they first started the China caucus, but that was many years ago. So I wonder what the caucus is doing right now. And the last question is for all the panelists. I'd like to know whether what's your take on President's visit to Asia, upcoming visit, and what do you expect him to achieve on the trip? Thank you.
I'll take the first one very briefly. The hearings, like I mentioned, when we launched in October, and Mr. Forbes launched with Ms. Hinabusa, it was really meant to start this formal process, but to see that it continued beyond that. And I'd correct, of course, it's not the China hearings, it's the Asia-Pacific Security Series, of which some of the concern that drove that certainly was the military modernization of the PRC. But a lot of what we talked about, too, was alliance management issues and some of these other questions, the Korean Peninsula as well. And so we hope that while this has come to a formal end just in the last couple weeks, that we see more hearings at the subcommittee level and at the full committee level when there is a future chairman next year and beyond that as well. On the China caucus, it's very active. We do a news update every morning. Economic security issues all related to what's going on in China and its relationships with the region and the United States. And we hold a series of hearings and panels and events like that. There was a foreign policy initiative panel that happened just a month or 2 ago on maritime disputes in the region that our office helped support. I think the president's
Yeah,
trip.
president's trip, yeah.
I think there's a lot of, I mean, I think the president's trip is incredibly important. There's going to be a lot of potential for that visit, partly going back to what I talked about earlier about just the need for diplomatic reassurance, more of a presence of U.S. officials in the region on a regular basis. And obviously, I think this was canceled in part, or some variation of this trip was canceled last year because of the shutdown. And so I think it's important that he's finally going. I do think it'll be important, as far as I understand, for TPP. It'll come at a key moment there, and hopefully that, I think, will force the president to get more involved. I don't want to venture too much into Brett's territory, but I do worry that maybe the White House at the presidential level is not as engaged as they could be in terms of swaying some skeptical Democrats on the Hill. And I know in the region there's a lot of interest in trying to have something that can even be announced maybe either before or when the president's there in April. And so hopefully that'll maybe force the administration to focus more on getting something ready on TPP. And then the one other thing I'd flag is I do think there are a variety of obviously regional and strategic issues to be discussed. I do hope, given that the president is visiting both Seoul and Tokyo, that he doesn't personally get bogged down in some of the historical issues we've already discussed. I mean, there might be a temptation to kind of try to get the president involved and to mediate, but hopefully I think Seoul and Tokyo can begin to work through some of these issues even before late April when the president's there.
Right.
Yeah, I think I would just kind of echo a lot of what Jamie said. He did miss the last heads of state meeting at the last, the heads of state TPP meeting back in, I believe it was October, due to the government shutdown. So I do know that, when USTR came back and when other folks who were at that trip came back, they were disappointed because, Ambassador Furman's great, but he's not, when it's a principals only meeting and, and he's a deputy to the president, he obviously can't kind of weigh in with the authority that everyone would always like him to do. So it is really great to see the president make it back over to the region and hopefully finalize whatever is left outstanding in the TPP agreements, and hopefully just kind of weigh in and just remind our allies and our trade partners over there that this is still a big priority of his and the administration's.
Just very quickly, I'll say, I'm very much agree with all the panelists on the bipartisan nature of Asia policy, and that goes for trade policy too, to large extent. So forgive me for just inserting one relatively sharp note, which is I think the president has generally been absent on trade policy and on TPP specifically. I mean, you say you hope he can persuade some Dems. I hope he can persuade some Democrats too. But I wish he would get out there and support some of the people who want to support a free trade agreement, whether they're on the Hill or off the Hill. I think it seems to me he's spending too much time chasing around people that are never going to support a free trade agreement, or whose price is going to be so high that you're going to lose the people who traditionally support free trade agreements. Oh, the lady over there.
Joanne Fan from the Brookings Institute. Just to follow up on the TPP issue, there are currently two trade partnership negotiation going on in Asia. One being the U.S.-led TPP, the other one being the ASEAN, i.e. China-led RCEP, which is wrapping up negotiation in 2014, this year. Is there a risk of basically having two trade partnerships covering similar scope? Is there a risk of asking your U.S. allies to picking sides on the economic front, and might also be counteracting towards the rebalancing strategy on the defense side?
So I think I'll jump in. I'll take the trade aspect of that question. I'll let some like the broader defense issues go to you two. But I think in general, we just see when market barriers break down, in general we see higher rates of growth. We see higher rates of just industrialization, and just so I don't want to say that people trading with each other and having two groups of blocks and having two separate blocks of groups of people breaking down trade barriers is mutually exclusive to the benefits there. I think the more you do see some market liberalization in this region, the better off everyone's going to be. And, I do think that the more we can encourage just an open market economy in Asia, the better off all these groups are going to be. So but I also don't think that, one succeeds at the expense of the other. If that's helpful. So.
It bears noting that there are 4 of the countries, right? Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, who are all engaged in both agreements. So I don't know that we're asking any of the countries to choose sides. It's also worth highlighting the phrase you used, ASEAN, i.e. China-led, which I'll just let that lay there. Did you want any defense implications? I mean, I guess there was some possibility of defense or foreign policy implications.
Yeah, I'd just say that, I think we often underestimate the strategic importance of TPP, especially given some of the issues we've discussed earlier about sequestration and just the general concern in the region about the U.S. commitment. I think us concluding TPP as quickly as possible would really send a strong message. I mean, Senator Rubio has always also been a proponent of making sure that whatever agreement we end up concluding has relatively easy on-ramps for countries that want to join later, which I think is an important part too, both in the Western Hemisphere where he's done a lot of work in the past, but then also other allies in Asia who aren't currently part of the negotiations, whether it's South Korea or the Philippines or Taiwan eventually. I mean, I think as long as it's an agreement with high standards that these countries then are willing to meet, and even eventually China, as was discussed earlier, I mean, this should be the sort of agreement that others can join, and I think that will just increase the strategic importance of it. So I just would emphasize that element of this as well, especially given all the broader issues with our focus on Asia.
Great, thanks. Right in front.
Thank you. Xiao Kuiyu with Guangming Daily from China. It impressed me a lot that the White House and the Congress are so harmonious in its Asia strategy. But what's the case in China policy? And more specifically, how do the Congress view the counterterrorism cooperation in light of the Kunming massacre? Yeah, thank you.
I'm not sure I can speak to the counterterrorism issue specifically. I wouldn't say we're harmonious, or the Congress and the White House on these issues by any means. What I would say though is, so there's the public and the private discussions, of course. One of the things that's been constant criticism for the last decade or so in the defense realm is that the White House avoids talking about the competitive elements of the relationship with China. Avoids it in careful language in speeches and in QDRs. It's the C word at the Pentagon that isn't spoken of. We come up with terms like anti-access area denial to talk about China and avoid saying it. One of the things, my boss actually wrote about this 2 years ago in a piece called China There I Said It. And just putting it on the table. There are elements of the relationship that are cooperative, and there's certainly elements of the relationship that are competitive, and have been on display in the last 3 or 4 years. I have seen, personally, a shift in the last year or two, and I think that's clear in the QDR as well. That the administration does see some serious concerns from the security side in what is a culmination of 20 years of military modernization, but how that's being translated into diplomatic priorities in the region. And you do see in a variety of forums a more clear-headed, I would consider clear-headed approach to that competitive side of the relationship. One of the main concerns I have, just to kind of add on to that, a year ago we talked about concerns and the South China Sea was hot, and I tried to say geographically I think the East China Sea is just as important, if not more important. This year I'd say, both those regions continue to be important. One of the things I would push attention to, and I think that the hearings that we've done really brought out, was we're very focused on the high-end conflict and warfare, and I certainly was biased towards that in my remarks about different capabilities. One of the things that I find most concerning is something that Japan is dealing with, and that is this non-militarized coercion we see from China. Some have called it salami slicing, where they're using various elements of diplomatic and ideational and military power, in some cases short of military power, Coast Guard ships, to to slowly, and legal warfare as well, to slowly test the waters, if you will, with Japan and with the Philippines, certainly at the Scarborough Shoal, and with the United States. And this is another reason to come, full circle why I think we need a broader strategy. The United States and its government needs a broader strategy for how to approach these issues. There's been some good reporting recently, and I've heard recently that we're talking in Track 1 dialogues with the Japanese and other in Philippines about these type of issues and how to deal with them. If we're not going to fight a big war, how do we deal with coercion short of warfare? There was a piece in Reuters yesterday about it, actually. So that's one of the areas that I'd really say that we need to focus our attention on in the next couple of years. And I think the QDR and these budget pressures have made us focus on deterring and fighting that high-end war, where it's a lot easier to start taking some of those things off the table that are important for preventing war. A lot of the exercises, engagement we do, for instance. I'll stop there.
I was just going to add, I agree with everything Eric said, certainly on the defense front. On your question about counterterrorism, I'm certainly not opposed to working with countries on kind of shared challenges. I think we do need to be careful, though, that we don't allow that sort of cooperation to be the driving force behind our relationship. We certainly tried that in the Bush administration with Russia in the years after 9/11, and even this administration, and certainly in the Russia case as well, tried to justify that as one major reason we needed to do the reset and have this type of relationship with Russia. And you see where that has ended up. And so, you can cooperate with a country that you disagree with on a variety of issues, and proceed with a policy in that respect. The other thing is I would say, I think at least amongst Republicans on the Hill, there's certainly a real interest in diverging from the administration on certain issues vis-a-vis China policy. One is the administration's perceived unwillingness to always be very as forthright as they could be on issues like human rights and individual cases in China, and on raising these issues in a very vocal manner with the Chinese government. And on the issue of kind of responding to some of Chinese policy in the South and East China Seas, I just know, whereas I think the administration took some positive steps in the aftermath of the ADIZ, there also were things I know that were troubling to a lot of people in terms of the restatement of the FAA policy about airliners supposed to be reporting information to Chinese authorities, and those sorts of things that I think sent mixed signals. And it does contribute to a sense that there's this kind of incrementalism in the Chinese approach, where they're slowly expanding their sphere of influence, and maybe the U.S., by kind of raising an initial series of concerns and then just kind of going quiet, we're not really responding in the right way. And so I do think there are areas of divergence a bit between the Hill and the administration on China policy.
Thank you. My name is Fumiya Kubo at the Wilson Center, and I have a question to Mr. Fry. I noticed that your boss, Senator Rubio, said in his TV interview with the Japanese TV company that the United States should support Japan on a territorial issue, not just on the application of the Article 5, but also on sovereignty issue, kind of criticizing the current government the attitude. And could you explain why Senator Rubio came to think this way? And secondly, to what extent do you expect his opinion will be shared by more members of Congress? I guess Senator McCain takes a similar stand. Thank you.
Yeah, Senator Rubio's position has been that while he understands that current U.S. G policy is to not take a position one way or the other about the ultimate territorial dispute related to the Senkakus, that he does believe the Senkakus are Japanese territory, and that's his personal view, and he's said that on a number of occasions, and like you said, I think a number of others have as well. I'm not quite sure how widespread that view is in the Senate, at least. I mean, I know there have been strong statements of support, bipartisan statements of support in general on the applicability of our commitments under our treaty with Japan to the defense of that territory, given that it's currently administered by Japan. So I know there's strong support for that, but I'm not sure how widespread that other view is.
You know what? We're going to have to wrap up in a second. So I just wanted to make sure I sort of touched on one area. It's interesting. I opened up by saying this is the 8th year that I've done this, and virtually every year, I would say in 7 years, no matter what the topic is, somebody stands up and says, "Yeah, well, what does that mean for Taiwan?" And it's usually Mike, so he's sitting there in the front row. I should have deferred to him on this question, but I wanted to just ask you briefly, maybe what is the health of Taiwan's profile on Capitol Hill today? How would you assess it? Maybe any one of you or all of you.
Sure.
If you'd like to.
I think it's strong. Last year I said that I think it had fallen a bit off the radar, but that's a result of sort of the positive things of a balance in the straits that was a little more quiet. At the same time, I think that, I've seen personally just there's a lot of members traveling through the region who are making an effort to make sure they go to Taipei. That's a great sign, especially when mill air is off and when member travel has been so limited. On the defense side, again, I'm the defense guy in the panel. Mr. Forbes is trying to find ways, and I know the committee is trying to do this as well, to encourage more cooperation. We did a letter, to the department in the fall about, of course, China's participating in the Rim of the Pacific exercise this year that happens every 2 years. We're not against that. We're not opposed to that. But we did say that if China's going to be invited, we think that there should be a reciprocal strategy or policy, and Taiwan should be invited as well. Surprisingly or not surprisingly, we got a no response. But what we're trying to do to that is follow up and say, okay, if not RIMPAC, then what? What are those other areas? And we've been working with TECRO and elsewhere to look at those other areas that we may be able to make further asks for cooperation. And as well, there was an air power study that was done in the past, of course, related to F-16s. We think there should be, and we'd like to push for a study on the maritime balance as well. The surface balance, the subsurface balance, of course, the submarines is a big equation in this. And so that's something I think we're going to be working over in the next couple months to try to ask the department, maybe in the NDA this year, to do a maritime balance as well.
Did you say you got no response, or you got
no
response?
We got a no response. Just kind of, of course, straight up, no thanks. We work with Taiwan in lots of different areas, but in this particular one, not this time.
Right. Okay. Any trade angle for Taiwan?
They obviously are very interested in TPP and what that means for the region, and have expressed a lot of interest, obviously, in joining it if that possibility ever becomes open. And but I do think it's probably fairly high up on the radar. I think I know Senator Menendez and Congressman Royce were both there in the past year, I believe. I think they've gotten also some other officials going over there. They're still obviously doing their MICA trips and bringing staff DELs over there. So I think at the staff level, they're probably one of the more well-known countries on the, or one of the more well-known entities on the Hill. And I think they're definitely at the priority. Obviously, the ractopamine issue, which I touched upon earlier, is still kind of a sore spot for American producers, and especially for the pork producers and some of the pharmaceutical firms that actually do promote ractopamine. I think there is a broader sense that this is kind of a bellwether for a lot of sanitary and phytosanitary measures, because historically, obviously, Taiwan and the United States have enjoyed, fairly close relations, and so if we see really areas of shaky science be used as a reason to exclude American agricultural imports here and in Taiwan, that's obviously going to expand to other states where we probably don't have, as long a relationship and as good of a relationship with. So I think that's definitely something that members from agricultural producing states are focusing pretty heavily on.
Did you have anything?
I agree with what both my colleagues said. I think the support for Taiwan remains very strong. I think we're about to come up on the 35th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act in the next month or two. And I know there are already a number of efforts underway to highlight that and hold hearings, and I know do some bipartisan letters expressing the commitment of senators to Taiwan. I just think, I've been to Taiwan twice, and for anyone who goes there, it's a very compelling place, obviously, in terms of an example of vibrant democracy in Asia. And I think, also it's always interesting to hear about tourism from mainland China to Taiwan, and all of these tourists and what they are witnessing on a daily basis when they're able to come visit Taiwan and see what one day might be possible for the mainland. On the defense side, I'd certainly defer to Eric on that. I will just say, I think there have been there's strong support for doing whatever we can from a Hill perspective, in terms of capabilities for Taiwan, but Taiwan also has its own pressures on its defense budget, which I think are perhaps limiting some of what can be pushed from Capitol Hill right now.
Great, thanks. Well, I really hate to end this, seriously, but what are you going to do? Please join me in thanking our panelists for the outstanding discussion.